So Jinny, thank you so much for being part of Relations. I feel like this collaboration has been a really long time coming, and so I'm very happy that we could finally work together.
Me too.
So I'd love to start with a little bit of your bio. You were born in Seoul and immigrated to Canada in 1988. You grew up in Montreal. You studied fine arts at Dawson. You did a BFA at Concordia. You did a little teaching as well in primary schools. You did an MBA. That's a big surprise. And then an MFA. And then you've been teaching, and you are now associate professor at Ottawa University.
Full professor, sorry.
Oh wow, full professor. They need to update your Wikipedia. Okay, well, I'm wondering, this bio prep is to lead into the first question. You know, you work in painting, sculpture, and installation. You work between abstract painting, which I'm more familiar with, but you also explore the object, and you seem to push the limits of both. And the themes that you investigate, liminality, impermanence, transience, the urban environment, globalization. I mean, they're all really kind of ways to get into philosophical questions in essence. And I've noticed that all the things seem to come back to a questioning of the self within the world in relation to the other as well. So I would like to start with knowing a little bit more about some of your early experiences of immigration, and if we could discuss how these might have prompted you to engage with making art.
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to the show, to have my work in the company of such great and exciting artists. It was a really nice exhibition to visit as well. So to answer your question, I think what happened with the immigration, I mean, the one thing that happened that was, I think, significant, one of the things that were significant was this shift of perspective that happened with this, change of location of living, and also with that change of status or state of being in certain geographical and social environment. And so, being a Korean national in Korea, looking like everybody else and not really thinking about other, while I was in Korea in my, first 12 years. And then coming here, suddenly becoming somebody who's not from here in a way. And so I think that shift is something that was quite significant in immigration for me. And I've had different kinds of shifts of perspective, over the course of my life so far. But that was really kind of the first one that kind of triggered this way of being and seeing things differently because of simple relocation.
Yeah. That shift in perspective, I mean, I think that's a very clear indication of the diaspora experience, where you are put into a situation where you have to see things in a sort of another body almost, mm-hmm. or you have another set of eyes. How did that experience propel you towards the desire to make art?
I think I kind of always thought I would be an artist. It wasn't like that experience that made me change. If anything, I think, sort of knowing that I wanted to be an artist when I grew up.
Wow.
Was something that sustained, I think, my kind of being. I think that was more of a continuum rather than like a break. And yeah, it's but I think in my making art, that shift of perspective is something that I think changed what I made, but it wasn't necessarily a factor in me, in my wanting to make art, because that was sort of always kind of there somehow.
Mm-hmm. Well, you describe your work as kind of self-portraits or self-portraiture in a very wide sense. Can you unpack that for us? I feel like, sort of the philosophical questions that have informed your art practice are so much part of this concept, but also the commitment to wanting to be an artist seems very much at the source of the idea of your idea of self-portraiture.
I think in a very extended way, I think we are all making self-portraiture in life, but I will maybe talk more specifically about my work. And I think that I realized that I was making self-portraits during sort of like in 2012 or something, when I was doing this series called Non-Painting Painting. And it was kind of my second chapter of my practice, where I was exploring materiality of paint. Mm-hmm. And painting is something that it's a medium that I feel very comfortable in. I feel like I know, about it more than other things in life. And so I am using painting to explore who I am in this world, like kind of this possibly cheesy sounding questions, but basic philosophical questions of who am I, where am I, what am I doing here, kinds of questions are really at the basis of, were at the basis of when I started to think about my work as self-portraiture. And if I can give you maybe an example of what I mean by sort of, when I was asking who am I, that question was equated to the question of what is painting. And so there's this work that's called Black Matter. This was done in 2014, I think, and it's Black Matter as in dark matter. So this is done on aluminum sheet that is about 4 by 5 feet. And I basically sprayed Korean ink on the aluminum directly without any primer or anything like that. You would think that water-based mediums such as ink would not adhere to, such smooth surface as aluminum or mirror or glass, but it does. And so you basically end up seeing this circle within a rectangle with some drips. And, I had to spray very incrementally and wait for one layer to dry and so on. But the ink is there on aluminum being kind of, reflecting slightly its environment. So for me, the aluminum is kind of, the environment, the world, or what have you. And I kind of conceptualize myself as like the ink on the aluminum. And so the ink somehow, there are two heterogeneous elements, so they should not stick well, but they do, and they stay, and they're still together. But, it's very prone to environmental changes. So if somebody were to spray some water on it or scrape it, it would disappear. The ink that's on top of aluminum would, come off and change, the painting would change its state. And I feel like that's how I stick to the world. I shouldn't really stick to the world so well, but somehow I do. And I find that quite surprising, but at the same time, I know I'm very, vulnerable or exposed to, whatever that's happening in the environment. So it is like a self-portrait, but at the same time, I think it's kind of like, it's not just me. I think it's a condition that we all kind of live in. And so in that way, I find what I'm doing is a self-portraiture. And more recently, so it kind of began with this exploration of the medium of painting and like questioning the materiality and the meaning of materiality and linking that with my state of being in the world. But more recently, I've been kind of examining myself more in socio-political lens when it was more materiality-based kind of questioning before. It was more of an existential questions of self. But now I have kind of shifted the lens to more sociopolitical perspective. And so it's still, I think, self-exploration, like what am I doing? What can I do in this world? Who am I? Those questions are still lingering, but from a slightly different perspective.
There's some really interesting things I'd love to pick up on, and that you work with objects as well. I mean, you have a sort of, you do work in sculpture and sculpture installation space. So the materiality, when you talk, you sound like a sculptor to me, you know, like the nature of certain materials will give you insight into the questions that you're trying to explore. And so we don't take for granted, you know, that painters are going to be predisposed to use certain materials as well. So you do turn that upside down, subvert it, and then kind of like mash it together, you know, in an interesting way. There's also the question of time, you know, the fact that you have to wait so long for paint to dry on a sort of slick metallic surface. How would time figure also into your work as a type of material?
So those two observations and questions are actually really linked together for me, in that I see painting, it's one way of thinking about painting, and you know there are many other ways, and I think that's what's really great about the medium. So I see painting, if you break down painting into materiality, it's never two-dimensional. And if you break down painting into a verb instead of a noun, so like I am painting. Actually, I have a series called I am painting, as in I am painting, but I'm also a painting, kind of plain words. And so if you think about painting as a verb instead of noun, then time comes very much into the factor in the making of it, but also in the interaction post-making. And you can feel time in painting, even though it is a static, you know, object. So I think about painting in that way. And so for me, it's not necessarily, painting is not necessarily an image. I disassociate painting from image-based something, but I think about painting more as a material. And so it's never two-dimensional, because if you think about anything that is on any surface at microscopic level, it's always three-dimensional. And so if you extend that to the world or to a larger scale, then, you know, my paintings that are on the floor are not necessarily like, they don't necessarily have to be categorized in certain way. Even though I do, you know, talk about them as painting, so it's a bit paradoxical, but I see them as painting in the sense that, you know, everything that is painted are painting, you know?
Yeah, yeah. And I don't mean to be sort of so, to perpetuate these silos and disciplines. Of course, I totally want to break them all down, and we should all be, you know, undisciplinary in terms of how we work. It's all really comes down to ideas, and what makes for the best, most impactful use of a material or a medium. So, I mean, it totally makes sense to me, sort of what you're doing. The curious, yeah, go ahead.
At the same time, I do feel it's very painting, and, this is what's kind of difficult about these silos and categories. Mm-hmm. And I think we can extend that to identity politics too, in thinking about that. But just to remain in the painting realm, like, I do think they are paintings. I say they are painting, but at the same time, I define painting in a different way than other people. And, there are many, many different ways of defining what painting is, I think. And so, that's just the way I do it. And because painting for me is really materials and the meaning that each material has. That is what's kind of interesting to me. But, in terms of disciplines and so on, that's kind of a more like bigger discussion, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, when you think about portraiture, we think very much in terms of figuration, but of course you engage with abstraction with reckless abandon, with like a real dedication. How did you come to find that as your direction?
I think so. I kind of think about my practice as like now myself being in a third chapter. And the first chapter I sort of finished in 2008 with this series called Story of a Global Nomad, in which I explored the limits of pictorial abstraction. I was kind of trying to get to and then I fell off the edge. And so I started to do the second chapter where, which is when I was exploring this materiality. And I think I was always kind of attracted to abstraction. I think going back to this kind of sudden shift of perspective and that happened with immigration, in that I think this distance that immigration allows for newcomers or somebody who's new in some kind of place, then you have more an eye that is, you can have a gaze that is a little bit more distanced than the inhabitants. And I think I always, it's kind of positive and negative. Of course, I didn't belong, or all these kinds of things. And so I always felt distant to the reality that I was living in. And I think that distance somehow made the seamless transition to abstraction. Abstraction was a language that made me feel it felt right, in the sense of, I think abstraction can come from pattern recognition, which can come from distancing oneself from, whatever one is observing. And so I think this idea of abstraction, or this affinity with abstraction, came quite naturally to me. But in the first kind of chapter, I explored the pictorial abstraction, and then I kind of felt I had kind of reached the limit, and then shifted to materiality. So thinking about abstraction in terms of materiality. And now I'm kind of like shifting again to this more kind of sociopolitical way of thinking about things. But I think it's still very much based on materiality and images, or, abstract, pictorial abstraction. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. In some of the things that I've read about your work, I know you studied American and European traditions in painting, but that there's also an engagement with Korean painting traditions, and a sense of their holistic quality. can you talk a little bit about that, about bringing those traditions together in your work? Do you sort of sense that you actively do that, or is it something that becomes more intuitive?
I think now it's kind of intuitive, but I can maybe describe one incident when kind of that sort of started to happen. So when I was in undergrad, I went to Korea to visit for a few months, and I took up this Korean traditional ink painting. And what was really great about that is it's something that I did not know before, where so you are, working mostly in black ink on paper. And the way that you paint with your brush has very much to do with the movement of whatever you're describing. And what I was learning more, these 4 plants/flower paintings. So they were quite prescribed kind of a way of painting. So for example, if I think about, how do you call that, orchid, there's this, there are different kinds of orchids, but there's one that has a long leaf, a bit like the spider plant leaf. So if I think about that, you basically like paint the one leaf and you follow the movement of its movement. So you're kind of following the way it is. And when the kind of fold or the fall happens, then you twist the brush the way that the leaf is twisted. So you're almost like bringing the way of what you're observing is to the movement of your brush. Same thing for like a rock, or like maybe like even the, how do you call the flowers that's behind you?
Oh, these are they're not lilies. Yeah, lilies.
Water lilies, right?
Water lilies.
Yeah, so even those, for example, the way that the leaf is described is it follows the way it is made. And it was the same thing, for example, for rocks. When you are painting rocks, you have to make your brush very dry. You dip it in the ink and you have to like take out excess ink. And then the way you're like moving the brush is really following the movement of it instead of illustrating or copying in small details, right? So you're basically, I think, kind of bringing the soul of the object into the way of painting. And I think that was kind of one instance when I really, I did it out of interest just because I was like, oh, I'm Korean, I should learn something, but it really kind of impacted my way of thinking about painting, how about describing something is not necessarily just about the look, but it is about how it is made. And I think that kind of is something that I carry with me in my work now even.
Wow, it's like you actually embody the object that you're representing, and then it becomes, I can imagine, quite a gestural process.
I mean, gestural, and also like, as you were saying, like time-based. So that kind of links very nicely with this idea of time and painting being a verb and gesture and all that. Yeah.
Well, you talked a little bit about the materials that you use and the kind of impossibility of their coming together and adhering. And let's get a little bit more into the meaning, I guess, of these materials, of the kind of paint that you're using, and the the insistence on aluminum, because aluminum comes up a lot as the sort of support. It's more than a support. It's it becomes kind of the receiver, I guess the sculptural, I guess, aspect of your work. And I know you do use more than just these materials, but these come up a lot in your work, in your practice.
Yeah, I started to use aluminum a while ago, and without really understanding what it meant, and just because I wanted to, and then a few years later I realized what it meant. And basically it meant that I'm kind of a lazy painter. In the sense that
Hardly.
In the sense that if I cut a piece of aluminum and put it on the wall or whatever, it reflects the reality in its own way. And so then, it's a painting even before I begin to paint. And so, voila, I have a painting right there. And, if you think about painting as like something that is reflecting the world, you have it. So I kind of felt freer after, to not having to put out what I perceive, because it's already there. And then kind of going from there. And so aluminum for me is, its reflective quality is something that is that means something to me. But I guess you could say, then why not more polished aluminum, or why not mirror? And there is something kind of really nice about the semi-polished aluminum that I am very attracted to. And I think at some point it just becomes just like very intuitive kind of liking. That said, I have done works on mirrors and glass and so on, but aluminum remains somehow with me. I can't, it's kind of a very limiting way of painting, because once I go too far, then I have to just start over. It's not like I can, because I do leave a little bit of the materiality of aluminum. If I go too far, then it's too far gone. There's no way of coming back. But I've been still like with it for a while, so somehow there's some attraction to it for me.
I'm curious also about palette, because there's been quite a like a monochromatic consistency in your work. Yeah, tell me about that.
I began to not use color at some point when I started to think about painting as a verb, and when it became like the act of painting became more important than making an image with paint. And so I just did not need colors. And I decided on black because I think it had one of the widest ranges of, from the thinnest to the thickest. But also I think because of my learning the Korean traditional painting, black was not foreign to me. And it sort of made sense. I think so it made sense as paint, and not necessarily in terms of it in a socio-political way. It's something that I'm sort of starting to think about. Because black, if you think about it in a society that has a very different kind of implication, it can't be just a color. And so it's something that I'm thinking about these days. I still haven't really kind of fully resolved that aspect, but at the beginning it was really just because I thought about painting as a verb, as an action. I didn't need color.
This is a good segue into the next question, because I was, noticing how when I first encountered your works, I detected more of an engagement with formal concerns, and in some cases like interest in modernist language represented by mesh and grids. But I've come to understand, over time, and and perhaps even when I just spent a little more time thinking about what all of these things mean, that how much you engage with social and political questions, and political often in regards to the unevenness of power relations. So I'm wondering if you can talk about, you know, the questions that have sort of pushed you to investigate, you know, through your work. And of course, I'm thinking of the first show. I'm thinking of Story of a Global Nomad, which was the first time I saw, you know, a really critical mass, you know, of your work in one space. Yeah, maybe walk me through that a little bit. Sort of what questions, what are these social political questions that started to bubble up for you?
I think the Story of a Global Nomad series was, I think, a little bit more, this was done in 2008, and it was done after my extended stay in Italy. And I think I was thinking about, so this kind of dual reality that I was living before basically broke down after I spent an extended period of time in Europe. You know, of course, I knew there were more differences in Asia and in the West, but somehow living it made me really kind of think about, because before my existence, I think, was on two-dimensional. It was like West and East, and it was kind of floating somewhere in between that line. But I think after living in Italy for a while, that two-dimensional map became very three-dimensional and chaotic. And I think, so the Story of a Global Nomad is kind of as a result of that realization of this kind of different map of my existence. And so I think it is, you could say it is kind of the beginning of like thinking about myself in a society. But I think what really, when I really started to be more directly sort of engaged with the sociopolitical aspect of the world and my being in it, is with my work called Don't They Ever Stop Migrating, that I presented at the Venice Biennale in 2015. And that is, you know, when I was thinking about, you know, what does it mean to be another? And me having experienced both being the national and also being another, how, you know, this kind of, I wanted to kind of explore this, our primal desire to exclude other, or, you know, kind of, and to, I guess, to think about my fear of the other. I think we all have the fear of the other, but when we don't necessarily, but we are not talking about it. And I think it's really important to somehow talk about it, think about it, enlarge what we mean by, you know, other, and like the further boundary, the larger boundary that we draw, the better. And that I think we can evolve as species in terms of this very weird, but also based in history of, like, you know, wanting to exclude what, and it is kind of linked to our survival as species. But I think at this point, we don't necessarily have to have that kind of primal instinct. I think we can evolve beyond that. And so I wanted to kind of talk about that with that work. And I think it is really that work when I started to engage with my painting in a more sociopolitical way.
Speaking of which, let's jump to the two series of works that are in relations. Why Does Its Lock Fit My Key? And Perpetual Guest. I'm so grateful for our conversations earlier on, because through that we were able to discuss the possibilities that might occur should these two series sort of be placed in the same space and kind of be in dialogue with one another. There are some really interesting tensions that come up, you know, in these works that bring the diaspora perspective, the sort of multiple perspective, into conversation with indigeneity, and then, you know, the historical reality of colonization, which brings up the notion of the settler, which becomes a very contentious and confusing term, depending on, you know, sort of who's looking and who's interpreting. And so maybe you could start by talking about why does its lock fit my key? We have 3 pieces, and they're intentionally sort of set on angles. They're not sort of straight the way we imagine conventional painting practices and hangings would happen. And you have this kind of very odd, off-kilter sense of perspective when you're looking at them. So tell us about that series.
That was so you think they are skewed, but they're not, in the sense that painting is just, those paintings are presenting a segment of reality, and you will see that there's always like a straight horizontal or a straight vertical line. And so in a way, that is just like a frame, right? So it's kind of saying like painting is just a frame. That is, you know, I wanted to think about this like reversal of power and reversal of position in a visual way. And so it's a very simple idea of these corners that could look like it's you're in some kind of space in a corner, or that you're outside of some kind of box, or there are 2 planes or 3 planes that are one beside another. So depending on how you look at it and how you perceive your own reality, you could be thinking about them as like a, you know, corner that's going in or coming out, or just 3 planes that are side by side. The thing is that you cannot see 2 things at 2 perspectives at the same time. You know, you cannot think about them as you being inside the box and outside the box at the same time. You can do one or the other in sequence, but you cannot do it at the same time. And that's kind of basically the simple idea behind that series of painting. And the title is taken from the book by Toni Morrison, Home. And there's at the beginning, there's a really nice poem where, you know, it says, why does its lock fit my key? And it is, you know, just really this power reversal of why do we think that it's always the key that has to fit the lock, you know? And so I was kind of thinking about what does it mean to reverse my position or reverse like power position of anything or anybody, you know?
Well, it's wonderfully destabilizing. Basically, you know, what you think is happening is maybe not what's actually happening. It goes way beyond sort of a trompe-l'oeil or kind of optical illusion. And it really, I find, gets me into a state where I'm even just thinking about the title. Like I'm really just thinking cognitively about this reversal of key and lock. Mm-hmm. And that in itself, you know, becomes a really, you know, intensely introspective, you know, moment, you know, with the work. Okay, so let's talk about Perpetual Guest, a work that is extremely fragile in so many ways and forces us to really pay attention.
So it's Perpetual Guest is, I think, began when Canada celebrated its 150th anniversary in 2017. I started to think about what does it mean for me to live here on Turtle Island and in Canada. What is my position here? And and then I did a residency in Dawson City in Trondheim Christian territory, and had the occasion to really learn a lot about the history of colonization, and kind of thinking about that triggered me to think about secular immigrants' positions and so on. So it is kind of another way of self-exploration, but hopefully relating to some others in the similar position. So I am thinking about, so those works are also in a way self-portraits, where I'm laying bare how I feel about my being here. So they're painted on glass, sheets of glass that are not tempered, and they are propped up by around eight aluminum pylons, and they're not fixed in any way. And so, and they're about like 4 inches off the floor. And this is exactly how I feel living on this land as a settler immigrant. And I don't know what that means really. And, I'm kind of now thinking, now I have another question that is kind of following up from that series, but it was just like really laying bare how I felt living here, this kind of cautiousness. And then there are also these aluminum pylons that are at least one pair that are spaced out, like the eyes. So, I always feel like, there are some presence that are looking up at us, me like walking around, taking up space, and, what does that mean? So it's kind of just my feeling of, it's just me being there. That's basically the work.
Mm-hmm. And then when you presented it for the first time at the Galerie de Lucot, you incorporated as well text on the floor, land acknowledgement, which you decided to bring also into the show in Montreal.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell me about the process that you went through to come to the particular wording of this land acknowledgement? And do you think that the land acknowledgement now is an essential part of the piece itself?
Mm-hmm. I think at UCO, at Galerie de Lucot, I wanted, because of, it's because of this kind of paintings that could be, I wanted to associate this idea with the work. I did, and I felt that just the title and, might not be sufficient for the work to really express what I was wanting to communicate. And I felt that having that text was important for the work to be read as, something that is standing really on top of this land. And I wanted right away to shift the gaze of our gaze to the floor. And, by having a text, it kind of does that. And then, so they're basically paintings that are normally on the walls, but they are on the floor. So it's kind of shifting the gaze. And in that way, I think it works quite well with why does its lock fit my key? Because it's like shifting and, shifting perspective literally. And so I consulted with many elders, like here, I consulted with Verna McGregor and Claudette Commanda. And, I was sort of, and, I'm starting to get to know, I live on Anishinaabe territory. And I'm starting to know a little bit of the history. And at the Fondation PHI, I also, consulted you, and then, some other people um, and getting to know what it means. Because when I was living in Montreal in my youth, I didn't really realize all this history. I didn't know about these histories, and so I'm now starting to sort of getting to know these histories, and it is important for me that the text is there and that the painting is not read just as modernist painting of some sort. It's very important for me that is very much there. And I think at Fondation PHI, it takes even larger presence in the installation. And it's almost like a backslash in the space. And I'm glad that I was able to do it there as well.
I think it's a really interesting strategy. And in terms of the discussions we had around the installation, I know you contemplated various ways of laying out the works in relationship to the text. And you settled on a diagonal, like within the space, it went on a diagonal. It didn't sort of horizontally bisect the space. And I thought that was a really interesting move, because the slash sort of implies a kind of sliding over or an ambivalence between one side or another, or I guess a tension, between the relationship of what's on either side of the slash. So I think about so much in that work in relationship to diaspora consciousness, or sort of the theories that have emerged around what the condition of diaspora is. And as you know, there's a lot of it has been around rooting and where you feel you can belong and where you can hang your hat and say, this is my home, when you are a diaspora person. Where can you claim, right? And with notions of territory and indigeneity, we've come to understand and acknowledge, that there is a claim, right? It's like, I am from this, I am of this land. And none of us learned about this in school. I mean, we were all prevented from acknowledging these histories, and it's like I think the land acknowledgement is really important, because the more we utter it, the more that we repeat it, the more people will understand, or it will sink in, on a really basic level, that we are on unceded territory. But that tension between what is the diaspora relationship with indigenous communities, and that sense of, wow, I'm like twice removed from a sense of rootedness. But of course, these are things that are always in flux. And I think that's okay. And I think part of being a diaspora person, and part of living with that consciousness or condition, is that you become comfortable with that. As much as that sounds weird, you become comfortable with being uncomfortable, with not really knowing which foot to dance on, but getting really good at doing that. You become an amazing dancer or juggler. And then your work also made me think about diaspora within the context of indigenous communities who were either removed from the land to live on reservations, or those who left reservations, to live in urban settings. I mean, what might their experience of diaspora be, in those instances? So there's a lot of layers and levels and intersections that your work proposes. But the one that I find the most provocative, perhaps, is this concept of settler. And I know that there are other artists that I know who are of, say, European descent, who acknowledge, you know, their direct European descendants, and then also will say, I'm a settler, sort of as a way to say, like, I acknowledge that I'm on unceded territory, and I have an ambivalent relationship with my national identity. So if my national identity is Canadian, and you know, you acknowledge you're on unceded territory, then you start to kind of like, not so sure I want to, you know, pay so much, or if you want to de-emphasize, you know, the validity or the value of, you know, the sort of Canadian national identity. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah. But I think it is, I mean, it, for me anyways, it's a first step to realize and acknowledge that I do have responsibility to, you know, towards the land that I live on. And I think it is important to recognize as a diaspora that we are part of the colonial force, and that, you know, we multiculturalism and, you know, the immigration law that happened in 1967, I believe, or is it 1976 or 67, that it was like a policy to populate Canada with non-Indigenous peoples. It was a very, you know, clear colonial policy from which I think a lot of diaspora have benefited, and we do take up space here. And so I find it important for me to recognize that I am a settler immigrant, and even though I'm not a European descendant, that, you know, I'm still sort of taking up space, and I do have privilege, and what to do about it, and how to you know, act responsibly, and to give up is something that I'm sort of, you know, I have to work through as I live here.
I mean, these are really important questions to be asking ourselves. I was reading the interview or panel discussion transcript, the panel that you were on that was also hosted by the Galerie de Luco with Amy Fung and David Garneau. And there were, you know, sort of ideas of, you know, what is a settler without a settler mentality? What if you are rooting without colonizing, right? Or wanting to commodify the land, or to even think about it that way? Is there a way to reconcile that taking up of space here? I mean, these are all really difficult ideas to, I guess, find some peace with. Do you know what I mean?
I think the question of belonging, as you brought up just earlier, is like quite key to all these questions. I think there is a way to belong without taking up. You know, I think it's just a very different relationship to where we live. But at the same time, I think realistically, practically, it is true that whenever we encounter slightest, you know, microaggression or something, we kind of like the sense of belonging that we felt very good about just kind of shifts very suddenly. So I think I go, you know, like it's like I change my position, or like quite many times, you know, when you talked about feeling comfortable with the discomfort, continued discomfort, you know, there is this 11th century monk, Hugues de Saint-Victor, who was very much quoted by Edward Said at some point. And he says something like, you know, one begins with feeling home at home, and then one feels home anywhere, and then once start he says the perfect man, but he says the last stage is to feel foreign everywhere. And this is kind of, you know, a state that I kind of espoused and I liked, but at the same time, now it's shaken. And so now I'm sort of, you know, thinking differently. But I think it's really nice to belong. There is this kind of, I think, human desire to belong somewhere. And I'm trying to think about whether it has to be, how it can happen as a diaspora person living as a diaspora in the world. And I think there are different ways. I'm still looking for one, but I think even when I find one, it's not going to be a stable one. And when Verna, the elder here, who was part of the discussion at UCO, you know, we talked a little bit about the sense of belonging. And, you know, she did mention a little bit like what you said, because she goes between Reserve and Ottawa. And, you know, her sense of belonging also shifts depending on where she is. And so, you know, it's not necessarily, I think, about these kind of designation that is given by society or, you know, a system that makes us feel like we belong somewhere. I think it might reside somewhere else. And at least that's how I can live in this world because of the condition that I'm in and that we are in. But I think those are the very questions that I'm sort of living through and working through. And I do that with, you know, by painting. And that's the only way I know how to.
Yeah. And it helps us too, sort of think these things through. My last question is related again to that panel discussion with Amy Fung and David Garneau. And it has to do with the question around abstraction. And abstraction coming into contact with social and political concerns. And so the question is sort of like, can non-representational painting be politically engaged? Yeah, the inference being that if it's not representational, can it really sort of pack a punch?
I think there are different things that have different functions in society. I think art can do certain things. I think street demonstration, street protest can do certain things. You know, I think education can do certain things. And I think that even though there are overlaps, they're not the same. And I guess you could say, so in terms of, so just kind of like as a basic statement. And then I think non-representation work is thinking about painting still as an image. And so I think it is kind of a slightly different way of conceptualizing what painting is than how I see it. And, you know, David and I had a long discussion about this because, you know, he went as far as to say it is immoral for that these non-representation paintings is immoral. But I think he also likes to provoke, and you know, we had really nice discussion about it. But I think it is true that when we recognize an image, it is more immediate. I think the reaction can be more immediate in the way of the viewers relating to the work. But I think there's also other ways of relating to the work And I think I don't really categorize my work as non-representational, even though I think, you know, it could very well be read as non-representational, because I do think about them more as material rather than, you know, image. And this is, so I think in the material of glass, that you realize and recognize that it is, you know, quite sharp and breakable and like floating. I think in that way, it is what it is. It's not non-representational. I think it is the object, you know, the glass itself is, comes with these meanings that we know, living in the world. We know to not, you know, brush your hand at the edge of the sharp glass. You know, we just know it. And so when we see it, we know it. So it's not necessarily a representation or non-representation, but it is itself, the object itself. And so in a way, I think it is very direct, but it doesn't necessarily always have to be direct either. I don't think, so yeah, it's like kind of not a very clear answer to your question, but packing a punch, I think, like a, you know, discussion like this, or a discussion I had with Amy and David and Verna, will be more about packing a punch, or, you know, writing a statement, and publishing it would be more like, would have more punch. I think my work has a different kind of way of doing things. Yeah, so yeah. That's how I kind of.
I hear you. You know, and basically, it would seem that your commitment to abstraction has, you know, there has very clear imperatives and ways of speaking for you that make sense, that have meaning, that are fully intended, and in that way alone, I don't really see that as, well, I don't want to, you know, take David's words out of context. So it's certainly not immoral. Maybe we'll just leave it at that for now.
We had a very nice discussion. I found him very engaging, and like really, you know, it's such a delight to be able to talk about painting in depth and have different positions.
Yes,
it was really great. Yeah.
No, it's super important. We can't let the discourse settle. We need to always be kind of, again, you know, the ability to juggle and to, you know, accept and make space for all these, you know, different perspectives is the life force. Well, thank you so much again, Jinny, for this time and for the gift of your work in the show.
Thank you so much.
I hope that we can actually see each other physically soon.
I hope so too.
Okay. Take good care.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.